On the morning of the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn dressed carefully in her apartments at the Tower of London for her final day as Queen. It is recorded that she wore a gown of grey damask, with an ermine mantle or cape, and a typically bold crimson kirtle flaming underneath her dress. On her head she wore an English gable hood, and ensured that she looked and died every inch the English Queen Consort. When they came for her at 8 a.m, Anne was ready. Anne's last walk took her from the Queen's lodgings past the Jewel House to her right, where Henry had once introduced her to the royal regalia. To her left lay the Great Hall, where she had once dined the night before her coronation, and where more recently her uncle had sentenced her to death. The month was May, and the journey on foot at that hour of the morning would have been a cold, dewy affair. As Anne passed through the cold harbour gate, she would have immediately seen the sizable crowd who had gathered to watch her die. All eyes would have been on her. Through this throng of well-known courtiers and nobles, Anne caught a glimpse of the scaffold for the first time. Draped in black material, the scaffold would have been high, but only large enough for her and perhaps 10 others to encompass. It stood before the Houses of Ordnance and the north side of the White Tower, which was adorned by the onion-shaped caps installed for Anne's coronation, and which survive today. William Kingston, the Tower Constable, saw the Queen up the scaffold steps to the platform of boards strewn with straw and railed around by a wooden barrier. Her journey's end could hardly have been a more fearsome one, and yet it was at this point that Anne asked leave to address the crowd. And I quote, "Good Christian people, I have not come here to preach a sermon, I have come here to die. For according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the King, and send him to long reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and a sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world, and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me." Anne had given the archetypal scaffold speech, save for one crucial detail. She did not confess to being guilty as charged. She only recognised that she had been condemned by law. Anne had made her last confession public by swearing on the host before William Kingston that she was innocent. With her carefully curated speech, that protestation was now much more open. Speech over, Anne's attendants then set about preparing the Queen for her end. The soft ermine mantle they removed had probably once been Queen Catherine's, and soon, after it had cooled of Anne's body heat, it would go on to warm the shoulders of Queen Jane, who will be betrothed to Henry the next day. Any jewellery would have been removed until Anne's little neck was bare. She removed the English gable hood herself. As was customary, her hair would have been pinned up, and a simple coif was placed over her hair. Throughout the process, Anne developed a habit of looking back, no doubt trying to identify and ascertain the whereabouts of the man employed to kill her. He was not dressed as an executioner was expected to. He blended in with the other officials present on the scaffold so as not to alarm her. When the necessary adjustments to Anne's attire ended, Anne presented the executioner, now present, with funds provided by the king. £23, 6 shillings and 8pence, roughly 2 years' wages for a skilled tradesman. Upon receipt of payment for killing Anne, the executioner then asked for her forgiveness, and it is likely they conversed in French, and that Anne indeed pardoned him. And I quote, "Madam, I crave your Majesty's pardon, for I am ordered to do this duty, and I beg you to kneel and say your prayers." The formalities over, all that was left for Anne to do was kneel into the straw. Had she died by the axe, Anne would have laid down prostrate at a low block to immobilise her. But there was no block to steady her. Anne had to hold her head up high. As she knelt, her ladies tucked in her dress so that when her body fell, she would remain covered. Perhaps Anne's last sight was of her crown-like onion domes on top of the white tower turrets, which fell like her rain into the darkness as one of her ladies tied a piece of cloth about Anne's eyes. Anne was now quite alone, and she prayed, "O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The nervous tic had perhaps been keen intuition on Anne's part. As she prayed, the executioner called out to his assistant for his sword, but the executioner had already grasped the weapon from beneath the straw before he called, and it lay waiting in his hands. It was the last betrayal. Anne blindly moved her head towards the sound of the assistant moving as the French swordsman swung the blade and severed her head from her body. The 1,000 days were over. Queens accused of treason had never been put to death before in England, and in the unusually hurried preparation, no coffin had been arranged for Anne. Her ladies placed her instead in an elm arrow chest. She was unceremoniously buried near her beloved brother George in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, only yards away from the horrors of the scaffold. Thomas Cromwell, the king's trusted adviser, would go on to tell Eustache Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador, that he had brought about the downfall of Anne, but that he had only done so upon the orders of the king. And I quote, "On or just after the 3rd day of Easter, the day when Cromwell was so disappointed and angry on hearing the king's answer to me, Henry authorised and commissioned him to prosecute and bring about an end to the mistress's trial. Since then, he was the one who planned and brought about the whole affair, which had taken him considerable trouble." It is here that we are told that the architect of Anne's downfall was Cromwell, but the person who commissioned Anne's end was squarely Henry, her husband. The employment of the French executioner had to have been underway before the trial of Anne and George, and this adds further weight to the understanding that Anne really didn't stand a chance before her peers. The king wanted her dead, and the jury's recognition of that desire was unanimous. The spilling of Anne's blood would stain her posthumous reputation for centuries, and the sexual nature of the trumped-up charges held against her have often cast her as a promiscuous temptress. But that stain was first made in ink, and it survives in the form of the indictment against Anne, held at the National Archives. It was conjured from the mind of a man who understood that a queen who was believed to have indulged in extramarital intercourse, incest, and imagining the king, her husband's death, could quickly be judicially murdered. Anne had been reckless, and had herself made an admission that could have been read as treason. This had brought an air of legitimacy to the otherwise squalid charges that were intended to shatter her reputation. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests that the charges were manufactured around hearsay, an anecdote, and a confession that was extracted most probably by torture. King Henry VIII had ordered that the crown of St. Edward, the crown previously reserved only for the crowning of the monarch, be placed on Anne's head to solidify her validity as his queen consort. He ordered that same head cut off to obliterate that legitimacy.